Is 3:30 here, and another version or episode in our Survive and Thrive series. Today we are focusing on forecasting. This is one we've been listening to feedback from the market on what you all wanted to learn a little bit more about. So we're going to dive into some of the basics, the keys around forecasting today. And the key, again, forecasting your business. For any of you who've heard any of our prior presentations, we are always focused on your business. It has to be customized, work for you. So we're going to talk about some ways today on how to do that. My name is Ryan Weissmuller. I am the president of Fintrepid Solutions. We partner with entrepreneurial businesses, helping them navigate the challenges and problems that they run into as they evolve over time. And interesting times they are right now. So we have a very unique bird's eye view and certainly some best practices, some experiences. And we're going to talk about even some case studies that we've seen today as we talk through this relative to forecasting. So let's dive in. As always, we try to keep these short, action-packed, and goal again is to get you to walk away with some very actionable takeaways that you can put into practice. There is, a lot of this is based on feedback that we get from the market. I'm going to answer a number of questions through the course of the presentation that we already have been asked. If there is anything you want to dive in, there is a Q&A bar up at the top. Go ahead, pop a question in there, and if we have time at the end, we'll certainly try to address that as well. So let's dive in. First off, we're going to talk about why forecast in the first place, why it is so important, some of the common objections or common hurdles to get over, the building blocks of a good forecast, really that foundation, some best practices, and then if we do have a little bit of time left at the end before we wrap, we'll dive into a little bit of Q&A as well. So again, the goal here, a practical approach. This is not going to be super technical. We may well do another series down the road where we can really get into some granularity on some specific areas, but the goal here is a practical approach. We're going to talk through these case studies, what we've seen, and hopefully by the end of this, you have some sense on how to get more comfortable with forecasting before it's all said and done. So as to why forecast, and it's a great question. It's one we hear a lot. Forecasting, I think, is a very misunderstood and frankly, the thought of forecasting in a lot of businesses is ripe with a little bit of fear and trepidation in some instances. In others, it's just not given the attention it deserves. But certainly what we can tell you in times like this, it is rarely proven more essential than these uncertain times that we're in, which seems counterintuitive, but as we go through this and talk, it's not. So really, fundamentally with a forecast, it allows you to get an understanding of the business like you've never had before. If there has not been a true forecasting process in place, that in itself is a game changer in terms of understanding the business, decision-making, et cetera. And really, the forecast is that roadmap. We're fans of a lot of different analogies. No different than you're taking a trip without a destination in a route. So you've hopped in the car and you're just going. Not having a forecast is basically the equivalent of that. And you may get where you're trying to go. You may have enough knowledge, you may have enough feel, but maybe you're going someplace new. Maybe there's different roads. So really, that roadmap is so essential to make the trip cheaper, to make the trip more time effective. There's a lot of reasons for it, but that roadmap is really, really essential. Second thing is, things change in the business. History does not always provide all the answers. Businesses, and certainly the businesses that we are involved in, on Main Street, the small and mid-sized businesses, they're constantly evolving. So it is rarely a point that 1 year is going to be a good indicator just at first pass of the next year. Things evolve, and so how do you account for those things? Without a forecast, you really don't have the ability to do that and to do it well on top of that. And as I mentioned, a lot of these things, it is really key in decision making. And I can tell you from experience, there are a number of clients we had a number of businesses that were very, very heavily impacted by COVID when that impact first hit, and put in a number of forecast plans, looking at different scenarios on things. And I cannot tell you for how many CEOs who had never gone through that process before, how valuable that was, how life-altering that was, giving them a confidence level that, again, even though they don't know what's going to happen in the macro economy 2 months from now, to at least have an idea of what that roadmap could look like, what decisions might be made, where expenses could move around. Really an essential tool in decision making. And I think an often overlooked area is forecasts can often bring issues to light. Things you don't realize. We have a client that we started forecasting with on really doing a rolling monthly forecast this year. And by doing that, when we were then going back and comparing actual numbers to that forecast, the business owner was very surprised to realize that some of their assumptions were very sound, and it was actually some areas that were missed from a performance perspective. It can also go the other way, where maybe there were flaws in assumptions, but it really allows you to spot awareness and issues that without that flag planted would otherwise be missed. And then the last thing I would say is it works. We have seen it countless times. And again, different businesses are going to do it different ways. For different businesses, different numbers, different factors are going to matter more than others. But time and time again, it has been a proven process. And for any business that at least has a forecasting process in place, I'm not aware of any single situation where that has failed them. Now, they may have forecasts that are better than others. It is certainly something like any skill that you get better at over time, but it just flat out works. It is an important thing to have in the arsenal. And for any business who's not, it's something you want to be thinking about very, very quickly. So some of the objections, and there are a number. I just put down some of the most common ones that we see. So first off, we can't plan. We don't have an ability to forecast sales. Maybe our business is too seasonal. Maybe our business is too lumpy, or we have large clients. We don't understand timing, etc. The simple reality there is all businesses can plan. And even estimates, even just decent estimates, are better than nothing. Because what that allows you to do, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, is you can work on ranges around things. The second one that's very common is it won't be right. And simple answer to that is you're correct. I'd like to think that the team, we're all very, very good at forecasting. We've never had a perfect forecast. And if you really think about it, the goal is direction, not perfection. So, unfortunately, we're living in a time right now, for anybody paying attention to the news, there's a hurricane heading for the southeastern United States. Think of that hurricane forecast map. Nobody knows exactly where that hurricane's going to hit, but we have those outer bounds where we have an extremely high degree of confidence that it's going to hit somewhere within that area. That's really all you're trying to do with a forecast, is get an idea of what are those bounds, and depending on where it goes, plan accordingly. So that focus on right, perfect, just get that right out of the thought process immediately. And then the last piece is that we don't have time. And what I will tell you there, and this I can say absolutely from our anecdotal experience from being in this and working with nearly 100 clients at this point, the time that it takes to plan up front is probably 3 to 4 times less than the time it takes to fix things after the fact, or to deal with the repercussions of not planning. So, think of it no different than you're driving on the road. You want to see that car before it veers into your lane to hit you. Forecasting is just giving you that capability. So let's talk about the really the foundational pieces. How do you start with a forecast? And I think this is often an area where a lot of businesses get stuck. So we're going to spend a little time talking through that, and really how do we set that table properly to get going? And the first piece that is essential is really dialing in the drivers of the business. And this is, again, where understanding your business is so key, so essential. What moves the needle? It sounds simple, but it's not. But really looking in, and there's a lot of ways of distilling this down. And one certainly is you can just see as numbers move over time. You can go look historically, and is everything just driven off sales? It may be that things are driven by volume that then filters into sales. It could be that margin is really the key driver, and you start there. For some businesses, it's headcount and really people, and maybe it's leveraging a revenue number per person. So people becomes a very key driver. Certainly payroll costs can be very large. Maybe pipeline is an impact for businesses that have long lead time. Perhaps borrowing costs, for businesses that are maybe very capital intensive. But understanding at the end of the day, what are those numbers, those factors, those data points that are really ultimately driving the business? Because there's going to be, for some businesses, for example, what they're spending on rent a month is just not going to move that needle that much. And if their rent costs go up 5% at the end of the day, the impact that's going to have on their business might be next to nil. But if their payroll goes up 5% or down 5%, that can have a very significant impact on profitability. So what are the things that move the needle? Start there. And it's not something that has to be perfect out of the gate. You know, most business owners have a good feel for this. You can certainly go through and test that out. And in future webinars, we'll talk about, as we kind of go next level on some specific examples, which we plan to, we'll dive in that in a little bit more granularity, but just understand those drivers out of the gate. The second piece that's super important with this is to be reasonable and conservative. So questioning assumptions immediately, having conversations and being cautious not to overshoot anywhere. This is a very common mistake that we see with forecasts, is it might be that maybe the sales projection is too rosy and can cause problems. You're better to end up a little over your forecast than under. And not two businesses have been in trouble because they had better years than they thought. So, you know, as long as you're not way off, it's better always, as a matter of practice, to be a little bit conservative, to question assumptions. Do we maybe want to pad a little bit more expense in this area? Do we want to maybe take a little off and back a little off our sales forecasts? And I will tell you, especially in times like this, where there's so much uncertainty, the value, again, of that conservatism, very important, because with this COVID impact and what we've seen, it's very hard to have confidence for a number of businesses on where sales are going to fall. But at least if there's a baseline that you can work off of, that gives you a starting point. And then if you exceed that baseline, that's a win on all sides. The third piece that's really, really important foundationally is getting input from multiple angles, multiple aspects of the business, departments. You know, thinking about, you certainly want sales input and what the top line forecast looks like, but key input from operations, obviously from the accounting side of the world and financial side, other key areas of the business. Every business is structured a little bit differently, but getting all those key contributors to both provide the numbers that they can control, but to also be a good gut check for the numbers as a whole, because they may have some input, may see some things from a little bit different perspective, and it just helps you to really dial in those numbers a little bit closer to reality. And then the last piece, and again, this is one that I think sometimes gets overlooked, understand why the numbers are where they are in the forecast. So understand the assumptions. Make sure that when you're forecasting, this does not have to be some big blown out, super complex model. And we've certainly seen our share. What is driving the assumptions? What's the underlying reasoning behind it? Certainly, there's businesses out there that will just include lots of notes around things. That's a very good way of doing it. Or maybe you have it tied to specific numbers. That's fine too. But as long as you can clearly understand, there may be some categories that you're just saying we're forecasting 2.5% higher than last year. That's great. You may have a cell, if you're using Excel, for example, that just shows X number times 1.025. Totally fine, but being able to trace that, because if all you have is just numbers on a page, you may not know how those numbers got there. And then when you go back down the road to try to compare it to actuals, you may have no idea how you got to the number that you did. And it's not at that point that you want to try to be figuring that out. So in going through it, you know what the assumptions are when you make them. Very important just to understand that, note that going forward. So let's talk about, now that we've got that foundational piece in place, let's really dive into what the best practices are. How do you really work through and build out the rest of this forecast, build on top of that foundation. Now we're looking at building the rest of the house. And as I mentioned, the starting point, we talked about those drivers being really the key fundamental piece, scrutinizing those very carefully. And what I mean by that is using those drivers, going back and looking. So for example, businesses that maybe where payroll is very material, or service businesses where, oftentimes headcount should and payroll costs should be in a fairly consistent range with respect to revenue. So looking at those drivers, does that make sense? Using those numbers and really starting there. before you go worrying about filling out all the line items, start with, let's just say, for example, the three really critical drivers in your business are marketing costs, payroll, and then revenue. We'll just keep it very simple. Work out what the assumptions are on those three numbers first. Start there. Use that as really the framework. Get those big numbers down. Scrutinize those. Work through those, and use those as the first piece of the forecast before you start trying to go down and figure out where what we're going to spend on office supplies going forward. Second piece, and this is a great segue, is just focusing on what really matters. And there's the concept, it's an accounting term, you may have heard, you may have not, but the concept of materiality. And really what it is just what matters. How granular do you need to get? What items in a forecast are large enough to actually have an impact? And there may be some things. Often office expenses is often one of those. There's going to be line items that it's just not that important to get super granular. I brought up the example earlier with rent and moving around. For some businesses, rent is very material. It could be a multi-location business where rent really does matter. For others, it won't. But understanding what are the items that really matter, what are those items that can move, and then there can just be some simple assumptions, things like professional fees, where you may not have an idea what that's going to look like going forward. Probably a simple estimate, as long as it doesn't end up being a huge number in terms of an annual spend. An estimate there is probably fine. Just a simple flat estimate. Now, there may be other businesses because of seasonality, because of when certain things occur, thinking about things like insurance, which for many businesses is a big cost. You probably do want to get a little bit more granularity depending on the size of the cost and the size of the impact, but really focusing on what matters. And I will even take that one step further, thinking about how you forecast sales. There are certainly businesses out there that can just look at a sales number. And forecast that pretty confidently. What we recommend doing is trying to really, how much do you need to segment some of these costs to forecast accurately? So we have a client earlier this year, and we obviously did a forecast to start 2020 and then redid that forecast when COVID hit to again course correct based on the impact. But in their case, we basically segmented it into, let's just say, their top 5 customers and then everybody else. And the reason for that is the margins could be a little bit different by customer. The timing could be a little bit different by customer. So by getting down, that next level and really looking customer by customer for the very impactful ones, we were able to come up with a much more impactful forecast and actually get to a blended margin out of that forecast that is much closer to what we see historically. But if let's say product mix shifts this year, or one customer buys a lot more and one buys a lot less, that margin's going to move. So being able to look at that, explore that, and figuring out where it's appropriate to go that next level of granularity and where it's okay just to stop, that's a really key piece of this, is understanding the materiality in your business. The next piece, and we've touched on this a little bit, is just the source of the numbers. Where do the assumptions come from? Certainly historical information can be very valuable. Getting departmental input, departmental forecasts. That could be a sales budget. Maybe marketing department has a budget of what they're planning on spending. There can be industry information that can be valuable. Anecdotal information can be valuable just based on certain things that are expected to happen. The key is taking all that information into account and trying to come up with the best number. But certainly the days and in times like this where we are with all this uncertainty, the simple forecast where we're taking last year plus 3% just doesn't work across the board. You can do it with certain expense items, maybe certain areas of the business, but that's just not going to cut it. So really looking at a good swath of information to come up with the best assumptions possible. The other piece, and really this is one where we tend to find a lot of questions being asked with management teams, is just what's new coming up ahead. It may be that there's new products. It could be that there's new customers. Is there maybe a change to the supply chain? Are there new people contemplated? Are we adding new members to the team? This is something that's very, very commonly overlooked. So if we're going to suggest a growth in sales, what does it take you to get that growth in sales? And we've certainly seen this where sales may be a little bit overshot, not realizing that, for example, we forgot to include the marketing costs that are going to take us to get that sales number, or we're going to need to add some more customer service reps to handle that increased volume. So thinking about the impact of the changes in the business and what that means for the business, and then just converting that into their impact within the forecast, hugely important. As I said, that one can be often overlooked and can cause problems. So start with, what do we think's coming? Drill that down into the numbers and then incorporate as best as possible. And again, we'll talk about this before we wrap. This is more of an art than a science. So it's going to be a work in process. Just work through it. Because certainly with changes ahead, if you're expanding into a new market or a new product level, you're right, you don't know exactly what's going to happen. Use the best guesses that you possibly can, the best estimates, and that's as good of a starting point as any. And then the last piece that can be key with forecasting here, kind of just getting that initial forecast in place, is seasonality and timing. There are a lot of businesses that are very seasonal. There are a lot of businesses, as I mentioned with that client of ours, that have customers that tend to be very seasonal when they buy. Understanding that seasonality, understanding the time impact. There can be businesses that maybe have very large annual spends, renewals of certain contracts. Insurance can often be that way. A number of insurance policies renew once a year. So making sure that you understand when you're forecasting, what are things that maybe hit consistently and smoothly over time, or at least ramp in a linear fashion, and then what are things that are irregular or that could pop up. And accounting for those, and again, that's also where the key to that assumption, the understanding the assumptions comes in, because you could have an expense item that you're forecasting $10,000 a month, and then all of a sudden in April we're forecasting it's going to be $50,000. Note why. So it's very clear, understood, and that makes it so much easier to go back and work with after the fact. So we covered kind of the pieces of how to get there. Where I want to finish the best practices discussion is around, what do you do with it after you've got that initial framework in place? And one key thing is certainly that you're revising that forecast over time. It's not static. Certainly you want to have a plan, and it's not to say that you take a budget and you throw it out the window, but you're going to learn things as things evolve. We've got a number of clients right now that we're all updating collectively. We're updating forecasts on a monthly basis, just because as information changes, we want to try to get more accurate. And again, going back to that hurricane map, as the hurricane gets closer and closer to shore, as you notice that band narrows, because as you're closer, there's less variability. No different than what we're trying to do with forecasts in this case. We want to update those, to refine those, to include the best information we possibly can. This is a planning tool. So there is plenty of value in laying out what was originally our 2020 budget. Nothing wrong with that. But then having a document as well that we're big fans of, quite frankly, just rolling forecasts, where you're updating it on a regular basis and using that as a planning tool, because you may be off in an area relative to your budget. Many businesses are this year. But what do we need to do? What's the impact of decisions? How do we start making up some of that ground? Very, very important. And so maybe for some businesses, quarterly is fine. But it'd be very surprised if you can get by just doing this on an annual basis. And you learn from it, which is also a very important skill. But the practice of that, going through it, you get better and better at it. I think that the second piece with those best practices is, once you've got the forecast built, is comparing it to actuals. I brought up that example of that client of ours, and we actually found in their case that they missed in revenue in a couple areas that allowed us then to dive in deeper. And we had very sound assumptions on how we got some of the numbers. We realized in some other cases that our assumptions were off. We had forgotten a few key pieces of information, didn't understand a couple things relative to how payroll might impact or be impacted in certain areas. So the forecast was off. Well, guess what? Take that learning experience. We revise the forecast going forward, because we're doing it on a rolling basis. And since that point, the forecast has been much, much closer to actual. So it allows you to spot those issues, spot challenges. And it may be, well, wait a second, we may have a month where payroll really was higher than it should have been. That's an opportunity then to go in, relook at the business. Do we need to clamp down in some cost areas, et cetera? So hugely valuable there. And then the last piece, and I will tell you this, I still think this is the most powerful piece for a business, is the ability to look at scenarios. And I'll use the hurricane again just because it's topical, but those maps and how those cones are actually defined is different models are basically predicting a specific track. And that cone, if you will, is an accumulation, if you will, of all those tracks. It's basically a collection of a lot of scenarios that we think we're going to fall within this range. The power of being able to work through scenarios, and this was a very proven, time-tested technique, and continues to be and will continue to be forward through the COVID process that we lived on a daily basis, is being able to move numbers around. What if sales are 10% lower? What does that mean for our business? What if we have to hire these 3 people? What does that do to our profitability? What if we have to raise our commission rates to attract the top talent? What if our margins erode because we have to, we have to liquidate inventory, and we have to do the best that we can to find opportunities, and we may have to do some things at lower prices than we would have historically. Being able to see the impact of those things to guide decision making. We have sat down with plenty of executives across the table as we're going through and actually having a roadmap of, okay, if sales are off 10%, this is what we're going to do. If we see sales continuing to accelerate, then we're going to start adding, maybe it's another sales rep in this area, or we're going to ramp up, production, add another shift in manufacturing. But having that foresight, looking at those scenarios, looking at what that means, it gives so much confidence to business owners. And again, we've seen this time and time again. I can't stress that one enough. So that is just a hugely, hugely powerful tool to have in the toolkit. So we've covered a lot, and again, we'll probably down the road get into some of these specifics and actually work through maybe some case studies in a little bit more detail down the road. But the takeaways today, and really my hope today was to get a foundational education on why forecasting matters as much as it does, and just the power of that tool that we've seen in so many instances. First thing is start it, do it. If you're not forecasting, start. There's nothing wrong with not having done it before. The most important thing is get the process started. Your first isn't going to be your best. Even going forward, you're going to have years where you're going to miss pretty badly. You may have months where you miss badly, but the process is ultimately what matters. So do it. The second piece that I would say is really understanding, what does it tell you? I talked about that client example of ours. Understanding the difference between, is something did you miss on an assumption, or did you miss on performance? The difference between those two answers is going to have very different implications on what you do within the business. Obviously, if you missed on an assumption, okay, why did we miss? What did we forget about? Let's make sure we fix that, change that assumption going forward, because that means the operational performance was where it should have been. If it's a case that it was a performance issue, then we assumed properly something in the business didn't happen the way it should have. And now as a management team, we need to go address that. Were we heavy on labor? Did we sell some goods at lower prices than we should have? Did we have some bleed in manufacturing where our margins went down because it cost us too much? Those answers are really, really vital. And certainly in this COVID environment where the margin for error for so many businesses has shrunk, understanding that and being able to address it, hugely, hugely valuable. The next piece is it's a living, breathing document. I talked about revising it on a regular basis, updating it, changing it, learning from it, the rolling forecasts. And I would tell you, to the extent you can, the monthly process is a healthy one to update on a monthly basis. Doesn't mean you have to, but certainly that would probably be our blanket recommendation. What does it tell you as you're going through that process, as you work through? And I can tell you, for most companies, after 2 months or so of looking to forecast actuals, you get a pretty good feel on are there themes where we're consistently missing? Are there areas that we're running into that are more challenging than others? Learn from that experience. That's how you get the practice. That's how you become better. No different than firing an arrow at a target. If you realize you didn't judge the wind properly, that next shot you make, you're going to course correct. So it is a skill that can be refined, and really any business can take it on and do it. And then the last piece that I'll leave you with, and I think is important for any business and something we preach, is what is good enough. Good enough to pass muster, good enough to serve the business, good enough to make things work where the business is and where it's trying to go. Small and mid-sized businesses can't afford perfection. They can't afford an army of resources who can just sit there and calculate numbers all day. They have to make assumptions. They have to make estimates. They have to get something into that Goldilocks zone. So at the end of the day, make it work for you. It doesn't have to be perfect. In certain instances, it may be that we're just going to make simple estimates to start in some areas and refine that over time. That's totally fine. If that gets you building out a forecast, working through it, working through the process, make it work. Own it, make it work for you, get it, find out what your good enough is, and start putting it into practice. So with that, we've packed a lot in here. I don't see any questions in the box, and thankfully we are we're right up against the gun anyway. So as always, we like to keep these very tight on time. Certainly appreciate you joining us today. If you do have any questions after the fact, certainly reach out. You have our contact info in the email, and happy to address any specifics that we can. Hope you found this valuable. Stay safe, stay strong. Good luck. Take care.